In color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Eric Seberide in New York, David Shoemaker in Los Angeles, Terry Drinkwater in Los Angeles, Nelson Benton in Atlanta, and Frank Kearns over the eastern region of the Mediterranean Sea.
Good evening. The polls are telling an incredible story tonight as Campaign 68 comes to an end. The race for the White House started as a runaway by Richard Nixon. But pollster Lewis Harris, in a final nationwide survey conducted only yesterday, reports that Hubert Humphrey's late surge has carried him into the lead. The Harris poll shows Humphrey favored by 43% of the voters, compared to 40% for Richard Nixon, 13% for George Wallace, and 4% undecided. It should be noted that Humphrey's 3 percentage point lead falls within what professional pollsters regard as a normal margin of error, thus clouding the findings. But 2 highly regarded state polls confirm the Humphrey trend. The Detroit News said today its latest poll shows Humphrey will win Michigan's 21 electoral votes. The News increased Humphrey's lead to 9 percentage points. And in California, a state that had been regarded as one of Nixon's strongest, the Los Angeles Times poll today showed Humphrey only 1 point behind Nixon, with a crucial 9% undecided. Humphrey and Nixon themselves emphasized the importance of California's 40 electoral votes by closing their campaigns there. In one of his final statements, Humphrey spoke bluntly of Saigon's refusal to join the expanded peace talks in Paris.
I trust that the government of South Vietnam will send its representatives to these discussions on Wednesday, overcoming any hesitation in carrying out its prior agreement. If the Saigon government fails to participate in these discussions in the near future, then I, for one, would favor making it clear to that government that we intend to proceed in the negotiations in any case. The foreign policy of the United States and the fate of young Americans in Vietnam should and will be determined by the President of the United States and not by any foreign government. That policy and those young Americans should not be placed at the mercy of domestic political considerations in another country.
Like almost everything else in his campaign, Hubert Humphrey's last motorcade is now that Nixon has been stopped. Humphrey has been convinced for about a week. California is a kind of test case. Just a week ago, it was solid Nixon. A reliable state poll now calls it a toss-up.
To a maestro, it's a symphony. To a drummer, it's a timpani. To a chemist, the experiment. To a smoker, it's a Kent. The taste of Kent. The taste of Kent. The taste of Kent. More taste, fine tobacco. To a banker, it's a modern vault. To a tumbler, it's a somersault. To an artist, it's some wet cement. To a smoker, it's a Kent. The taste of Kent. The taste of Kent. The taste of Kent. More taste, fine tobacco.
If you smoke a filter cigarette, try the taste of Kent.
In Los Angeles, Nixon made an unexpected public appearance today, and he, like Humphrey, spoke out about the new complications in the Vietnam peace talks. Terry Drinkwater reports.
Nixon had planned to spend this final day of the campaign in his hotel room, preparing for tonight's nationwide telethon. But then he changed his mind and decided to visit one of his headquarters in Los Angeles. He wanted for one last time to spur on the Republican get-out-the-vote effort. Nixon's whole campaign was a model of smooth efficiency. He needs that same kind of efficiency at the precinct level tomorrow, and he says he'll have it. Nixon made his Election Eve prediction today. He has said all along that he would do a few points better than either the Gallup or Harris polls showed. He said his margin of victory would be 3 to 5 million popular votes.
I have said to members of the press that we will run 3 points better than the last Gallup or Harris poll indicated. I make that prediction flatly today. The polls indicate that we will win by 42 to 40. We will run 3 points better than that.
On Vietnam, Nixon was indirectly critical of the Johnson administration's handling of pre-negotiation diplomacy. He pointed to the diplomatic confusion which has followed the bombing halt.
When we consider the fact that it was only 3 days ago that the hopes for peace were tremendously high as a result of the bombing pause, and that now those hopes are quite discouraging because of the developments since then, it is clear that if we're going to avoid what could be a diplomatic disaster, it's going to be necessary to get some new men and a more united front in the United States of America. I will do everything that I can assure you, as the President-elect, with your help, to see to it that we can work with President Johnson and put together those fragile hopes of peace that now seem to be hopelessly apart. I believe it can be done. I believe that South Vietnam can be brought to the conference table.
Every candidate has to be even more professionally optimistic on election eve than during the campaign. But Nixon's optimism is much more than just a show. As he recalled today, he is won a few in California and lost a few. But this time, Richard Nixon and his staff virtually radiate confidence. Herb Klein, his communications director, predicts flatly 330 electoral votes. And he says that's a conservative victory estimate. Terry Drinkwater, CBS News, with the Nixon campaign in Los Angeles.
Nixon's remarks about the polls came before publication of Harris's latest findings. After the new survey, Nixon campaign manager John Mitchell accused Harris of a, quote, gratuitous concoction, and said the public won't be swayed by it. George Wallace, who began his remarkable run for the presidency in the South, returned to that region for his final campaign appearance. Nelson Benton reports.
The third-party candidate wound up his campaign today amid a sea of Confederate flags on the steps of the Georgia State Capitol. Governor Lester Maddox did the introductory honors.
I give you, my friend and yours, the friend of people who love their liberty, love their children, love their country, the next president of the United States, the Honorable George C. Wallace.
George Wallace started his campaign in the South. He traveled the entire country, and he picked the South as a place to end it. Wallace walked in to face about 7,000 supporters, whose ranks were sprinkled with those of other persuasions, some signs with unkind words for the Wallace-LeMay ticket. A few young black people shouted their disapproval of the third-party candidate. Adjacent to their protest was a rather substantial Nixon demonstration. That apparently set the candidate into this part of his speech.
You know, Mr. Nixon said not long ago that George Wallace is not fit to be president. You know what he was really saying? You know what, my Nixon friends, he was really saying? He was saying that no Southerner is fit to be president of the United States because the Republican Party has looked down their nose at every Georgian and every Alabamian and every Southerner for the last 100 years, and they haven't contributed one good thing to the people of this part of the country.
George Wallace likes to say that his movement is not a sectional one, but he underscored his Southern political heritage by winding up his campaign here on the steps of Georgia's Capitol. The debate over whether it is or is not a sectional one will be settled tomorrow, at least from a practical standpoint. But if the polls are any indication, George Wallace's movement from an electoral vote standpoint is still as Southern as grits and gravy. Nelson Benton, CBS News, Atlanta.
At stake in tomorrow's election, in addition to the presidency, are 34 Senate seats, all 435 House seats, and 21 governorships. Some 70 to 75 million Americans are expected to cast their ballots. And the Weather Bureau says voting weather across the country should be good, sunny and cool most places, with nothing worse than occasional rain or showers.
Uh-oh. Dandruff got you itching again? You need something to help solve your dandruff problem before things really become embarrassing. Get Head & Shoulders. Use it every time you shampoo. Great lather. Leaves hair clean. Easier to handle, too. So don't let dandruff problems embarrass you. Get Head & Shoulders, the most effective dandruff shampoo you can buy.
We have a 70, 72.50 and a half, and a half, and a half. What about 72.50? 72.50, 75, 75. So,
Lisa. I only had one cavity.
Great.
Hey, only one cavity?
What's your secret?
Well, she's...
Mom changed to Crest.
That's it. She brushed with Crest. All right, we have
So sure Crest did it.
Well, we tried a lot of toothpaste, but Crest, best she's done yet.
Of the 5 leading toothpastes, only Crest has stannous fluoride to fight cavities.
As this presidential campaign ends, we go now to national correspondent Eric Severide for some thoughts on the race. Eric?
One of the strangest of American national election campaigns is now mercifully almost over. Not a single memorable speech as political literature has adorned it. No overriding national aspiration has emerged. It has reflected rather contradictory clusters of vague hopes and sharp resentments. No philosopher is saying of the American presidential election this year what the Englishman John Bright said in the 19th century, that the whole world offers no finer spectacle than this. It offers no higher dignity. This time the dignity resides, as always, in the basic capacity to transfer power without bloodshed, which so many societies cannot do. Not in this year's way of doing it. Whoever is elected president will have been chosen by a numerical minority of the people by present evidence. That is a familiar story. The last such was John Kennedy. In Truman's election, only half the eligible voters voted, and he received slightly less than half of those. So only a quarter of the full electorate chose him, yet he governed, and not so badly. Then the 2 candidates failed to excite great masses of people. Today this is true once again. But this time, in addition, some of the sit-outs will refuse to vote out of positive protest. And many of these are people who seem to think American politics should be a transaction in moral absolutes, which it never is. Were it so, power could probably not be transferred without bloodshed. Lord Russell once said that men hold the beliefs that suit their passions. It seems so this particular year. More of the poor, the surveys show, will vote for Humphrey than for Nixon, even though workers' take-home pay has been definitely affected by rising prices in recent months. More of the rich will vote for Nixon than for Humphrey, even though corporate profits and dividends have hit record levels under these 8 Democratic years, and Wall Street has been on a long-lasting joyride. Passions do seem more important than pocketbooks in this country. It might be argued, indeed, that it is the state of mind of the country that is in bad shape, not the state of the country, which cuts little ice as far as tomorrow's spectacle is concerned. In an election, realities have no life of their own. It is what people think the realities are that counts when those ballots are counted. Walter?
A Viet Cong delegation arrived in Paris today for the expanded Vietnam talks. Its leader, the 41-year-old woman, Mrs. Nguyen Thi Binh, declared that the war will go on unless the Allies agree to communist terms for a settlement. There were hints by both the United States and North Vietnam today that Wednesday's session of the talks may be postponed because of the boycott by the Saigon government. Again today, South Vietnam's President Thieu said he is not going to send a negotiating team to Paris because of the presence of the Viet Cong. But Saigon sources said they do not expect Thieu to hold out indefinitely. Later in this broadcast, we'll report Saigon's version of the events that led to Thieu's present stand. In the war, there were again no major actions, but Allied units reported killing 200 Viet Cong in a series of small engagements across the country. American casualties were described as light.
Dessert?
I'd like something cool like ice cream.
Ice cream?
But not ice cream.
Oh?
Something smooth like pudding. No, I'd like some fresh fruit. No, wait. Something refreshing like sherbet. No.
Why don't you have them all? Have Jell-O gelatin. It's cool, light, smooth, refreshing, and tastes like fruit, all at once. Jell-O brand gelatin. It's the best of everything.
High over South America, coffee bean country, passengers on Braniff Airlines are being served Sanka coffee without their knowing it.
Where are you from?
From Buenos Aires.
Did you like the taste of the coffee?
It's very good. I like it.
It was Sanka coffee.
Oh, really?
Do you find any difference on the flavor?
No, I really didn't. I thought if I had Sanka, I would know the difference, but I guess I don't. Surprising Sanka coffee. 97% caffeine free. But caffeine adds no taste to coffee.
Jordan announced today that troops loyal to King Hussein smashed an uprising by Palestine commandos in several hours of street fighting in Amman. Reports said at least 16 persons were killed and 40 wounded. The rebels were described as members of a Syrian-backed group opposed to Hussein's moderate stand on Israel. Funeral services were held yesterday in Athens for George Papandreou, the last prime minister elected in Greece before the military junta took over. He had died Friday at the age of 80. Ceremonies began at noon in Athens Cathedral, and many present and former Greek officials attended, although the family specifically turned down a government offer for a state funeral. Tens of thousands of mourners turned out to pay their respects, and the pallbearers found themselves swept along by the crowds as they carried the coffin out of the cathedral. Although Papandreou's grandson was among the mourners, his son Andreas was not. He remained instead in Sweden, where he's attempting to build an organization against the current Greek regime. It was estimated that 50,000 Greeks massed outside the cathedral, and thousands of others lined the 2-mile processional route. Gradually, the emotional mood over the death of Papandreou gave way to defiant chants against the government. The crowds chanted Papandreou's name, sang the national anthem, and called for a return to parliamentary government. It was the first major demonstration since the junta took power, and several dozen persons were arrested for violating the government's ban against such political demonstrations. For more than a year, the Soviet Union has been building up its naval strength in the Mediterranean, where large-scale NATO military exercises are scheduled to begin tomorrow. Recently, the Russians added a very special kind of ship to its Mediterranean fleet, and CBS News correspondent Frank Kearns went along on a plane looking for it.
Searching for the Soviet mystery ship, the helicopter carrier, the Moskva, is a little like looking in the Atlantic Ocean for a tin can. From this eastern end of the Mediterranean to Gibraltar is 2,000 miles. The Mediterranean itself, more than 1 million square miles of water. Our escort, a P-2, a Lockheed Neptune, a maritime reconnaissance bomber. In the air over this vast sea, it's a constant companion, a welcome escort to our aging search plane. The hours drag by. 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours. Then suddenly the pilot reports the Moskva dead ahead, northeast of Athens, between Greece and Turkey, just off the island of Lesbos. There she is, the mysterious, elusive Moskva, big, some 650 feet long. It's easy to see why the Americans call her half a flat top, a half carrier. The only flat top or flight deck space is aft the bridge in the rear half of the ship. The Moskva can hold up to a squadron of helicopters, 12 to 16. The forward half of the deck is occupied by the bridge superstructure and weaponry. Air-to-air missiles, surface-to-air missiles on the bow, torpedo tubes on the sides, reportedly for anti-submarine warfare. All around the Moskva, like a mothership, escorting vessels of the Soviet fleet. The Moskva doesn't come even close to closing the carrier gap. It doesn't even approach the power of a U.S. carrier. It can't take fixed-wing planes. But it does underline the continuing expansion of the Soviet fleet here in the Mediterranean. Frank Kearns, CBS News in the Eastern Mediterranean.
A Houston to Miami jetliner with 65 persons on board was hijacked today after leaving New Orleans and forced to fly to Cuba. The plane landed safely at Havana, and witnesses described the hijacker as a Negro who said he was a black nationalist and who gave the Black Panther salute as he left the plane. It's expected the plane, its crew, and remaining passengers soon will be released. Officials of the Moore McCormick line said today that Captain Charles Reed of the liner Argentina, who disappeared last week during a Caribbean cruise, apparently committed suicide by jumping overboard. They made the statement after the ship docked in New York this morning. The death toll now is above 100 and may go much higher in floods and landslides in northern Italy. The greatest toll of death and destruction has occurred in the area around Turin, and serious flooding is reported in the canal city of Venice. Just 2 years ago, 113 persons died in floods in that same area. Prices closed mixed on the New York Stock Exchange today. Volume was of almost 11 million shares. The exchange index gained 2 cents. There are many ways of settling political differences besides having an election. In Argentina yesterday, a retired admiral and a newspaper editor tried to thrash out theirs with sabers. The editor, Jovan Biglieri, seen here, had labeled former naval commander-in-chief Benigno Varela a traitor. In mid-1966, Varela had helped overthrow President Ilya, whom Biglieri supported. Even though dueling is illegal, the two men met at dawn on a private estate on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. The 2-minute rounds were broken by 3-minute rest periods, and the contest finally was halted, with Varela being declared the loser. Both men suffered minor injuries, and Biglieri later displayed his for newsmen. Tomorrow in this country, many political wounds will be inflicted at the polls. Although bloodless, they'll hurt just as much.
What's been going on in American business lately is ironic. Business keeps growing, but profits aren't keeping pace. The cost of doing business is costing business profits. And the sad fact is, a big part of this profit squeeze is happening right under your nose. Today, it costs $2.54 to get a simple business letter written and out the door. $2.54 a letter. If you have 100 people in your office, each writing just 5 letters a day, it's more than $2.54. It's more than $304,000 a year. Too much of it in mistakes. American business has to find a better way to write.
And during the next decade. Regards.
Dictating with IBM equipment is a better way. Nearly twice as fast as a secretary taking shorthand. And with the IBM MTST automatically turning a secretary's rough draft into a page of final copy every 2 minutes, secretaries can get those thoughts out the door, revisions included, in just about half the time. And since these 2 pieces of IBM equipment have increased people's productivity by as much as 50%, what you can get is part of that $300,000 back.
In the present deadlock and bitter division between Saigon and Washington over the bombing halt and the Paris peace talks, there is a considerable difference in the accounts of the negotiations between the two capitals. The United States indicates that Saigon balked at the last minute in refusing to send a delegation to Paris. But today, a version of Saigon's position is at odds with that. It's a story alleging Washington ultimatums, unilateral action, implied threats, and conflicting assurances. CBS News correspondent Murray Frumpson has obtained the story being circulated in South Vietnamese government circles, giving their version of the events leading up to the November 1st bombing halt. And here is that version. The contacts began on October 13th, when Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker told President Thieu that the bombing would be halted within 3 hours and that a Saigon delegation would be flown to Paris within 24 hours to take part in expanded talks. Thieu rejected the plan as impossible on such short notice. 3 days later, on October 16th, Thieu also rejected a joint communique proposed by Bunker, announcing that he and Mr. Johnson had agreed to a bombing suspension. The proposed statement said there had been, quote, absolute assurances of good faith by Hanoi. But Thieu pointed out it failed to spell out what Hanoi was prepared to do in the way of de-escalation, and it failed to include a pledge of Hanoi's willingness to enter into direct talks with Saigon. Finally, after more fruitless talks, the Thieu government, according to this Saigon story, asked for a reading of North Vietnam's intentions from Averell Harriman, the U.S. representative at the Paris meetings. On the night of October 31st, Saigon received a cable from its observer in Paris, saying he had been told off by Harriman in extremely blunt language. Harriman was quoted as saying, "The government of Vietnam does not represent all of the people of South Vietnam. The government does not control all of the territory of South Vietnam. You would do well to remember that we have 500,000 troops in South Vietnam. It is difficult to get Hanoi to agree to anything. We have no guarantees of any kind." End quote. The South Vietnamese expressed shock. They'd been told by Bunker of commitments by Hanoi, and now Harriman was saying exactly the opposite. An angry Thieu called in Bunker and told him, quote, "If you are lying or are going to be deceived by Hanoi, perhaps you should let the government of Vietnam make the direct contacts with Hanoi," end quote. Later, there was a meeting of Thieu, Key, Bunker, and Deputy U.S. Ambassador Samuel Berger, and Key was quoted as telling the Americans, if halting the bombing before November 5th is so critical, why not just put out a communique confining it to that, and then let us pursue private preliminary negotiations with Hanoi, end quote. Berger was quoted as telling Key, "You can talk to Hanoi for 10 years and they will never agree." Key retorted, quote, "Mr. Ambassador, who are you negotiating for, Washington or Hanoi?" End quote. Well, throughout these many meetings, the Thieu government kept returning to the same points. One, Hanoi was never specific in assurances of a military de-escalation. And secondly, Thieu wanted a firm pledge that the Viet Cong would not be seated at the Paris talks as a separate entity. Thieu apparently did not receive satisfaction on either point. When on November 1st the bombing halt was announced, the Thieu government was described as surprised and dazed. Correspondent Prompson quoted a Saigon official as saying, "President Johnson has put us up against the wall with a fait accompli. We never agreed to go to Paris, and he implied we did." Again, this account comes from Saigon government circles, and it conflicts sharply with Washington's version. This afternoon, CBS News correspondent Daniel Shore showed Prompson's Saigon account to State Department officials, and they made these points in response. Ambassador Bunker, on October 13th, did ask Thieu to concur in a bombing suspension. There was no effort to stampede the South Vietnamese, but Thieu did indeed agree to the American plan on that date. However, 2 days before the bombing halt announcement, Saigon suddenly demanded that Washington obtain assurances that Hanoi would not claim the Viet Cong were a separate party to the talks. And this, the United States was not in a position to undertake. Hence, say these State Department officials, the present deadlock. And that's the way it is. It's Monday, November 4th, 1968. This is Walter Cronkite, who is part of the CBS News team, will be reporting tomorrow's election results, beginning at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Good night.
Direct from our newsroom in New York, in color, this has been the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.